Picture a small medieval village, a kind where the streets are little more than muddy tracks and houses lean against one another like tired old men. As the sun dips below the horizon, the day's labor ends. Farmers return from the fields, their boots heavy with soil. Bakers finish stacking loaves for the next morning. The blacksmith wipes soot from his brow. And as the village exhales the sigh of a day's work, one place begins to glow brighter, the tavern. The tavern was not simply a building, it was the very heartbeat of medieval social life. Built of timber and stone, with a thatched or shingled roof, its appearance was plain from the outside. A heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron hinges, was the only true welcome. But behind that door lay warmth, laughter, and a temporary escape from the harsher edges of medieval living. Step inside and you would be met with an immediate shift of atmosphere. The air carried the scent of smoke from the great hearth fire, mixed with the unmistakable aroma of ale, roasted meat, and bottles gathered too close together. A faint haze drifted in the room from tallow candles sputtering in their iron holders. Shadows danced along the uneven plaster walls, making the place feel alive. The floor creaked underfoot, often just packed dirt covered in rushes or straw to soak up spills. Tables and benches were crude, hacked together from local wood, their surfaces scarred by years of mugs thumping down. Knives carving idle patterns and elbows leaning heavily after one too many drinks. The tavern was not polished, but that was never the point. It was functional, familiar, and comforting. The moment you walked in, you would hear the soundscape of the tavern wrap around you. A mixture of low murmurs, bursts of laughter, the clinking of mugs, and the crackle of the fire created a music of its own. Occasionally, a lute might be strummed by a wandering minstrel, filling the smoky room with a melody that rose above the chatter. The people inside were as varied as the drinks served. At one table, a pair of weary farmers sat nursing mugs of weak ale, talking in slow tones about weather and crops. At another, a group of traveling merchants compared stories of distant towns, their gestures wide, their voices louder with each refill. A solitary traveler might linger near the fire, cloak still damp from the road, grateful for a bowl of stew and the hum of life around them. The tavern keeper was always central to the scene. Sometimes it was a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh, sometimes a sharp-eyed woman who knew every customer's habits better than they did themselves. They were more than hosts. They were referees, peacekeepers, gossip spreaders, and occasionally the ones to shoo out those who had stayed too long. What made the tavern special was not only the drink but the sense of belonging. For many peasants, the home was cold, dark, and quiet. The tavern was warm, lit, and filled with voices. Here, people who spent their days toiling in solitude found companionship. Here, travelers found welcome. Here, news was exchanged, stories were told, and the simple act of sharing a drink became a ritual of community. To step into a medieval tavern was to step into a space of relief. Outside, the world could be uncertain plagues. Poor harvests, taxes, and wars always loomed. Inside, for a few hours, people could laugh, eat, drink, and feel the comfort of being among others. It was not grand, but in its own way it was magical. Now that we are settled by the fire, let us consider what exactly one would drink in such a place. Unlike the modern pub with rows of bottles and polished taps, the medieval tavern offered only a handful of options, each one deeply tied to local resources. The most common by far was ale. This ale was not the golden, sparkling liquid we might imagine today. It was thick, cloudy, and sometimes had bits floating in it. Brewed from barley, oats, or whatever grain was available, ale was earthy in taste and surprisingly nourishing. In fact, it was often considered food as much as drink. Most ale was small ale, meaning it was relatively weak in alcohol, safe enough that even children might drink it in moderation. Stronger ale did exist, but it was more expensive and not an everyday luxury. Wine was far rarer and usually reserved for towns along trade routes or for wealthier patrons. Imported from France, Spain, or Italy, wine was costly. If you saw someone with a cup of wine in a tavern, chances are they were either a merchant celebrating a successful deal or a member of the clergy who had access to better supplies. Wine was not served in delicate glasses, but rather in wooden or pewter cups, just like ale. Mead, a drink made from fermented honey, had an almost mythical status. It was not as common as ale but held a special charm. When available, it was sweet, warming, and deeply associated with feasting and celebration. Some minstrels sang of mead in their songs, linking it to ancient heroes and kings. One must also imagine the water of the time. It was often unsafe to drink, especially in towns and villages where rivers doubled as waste dumps. This is why ale and other fermented drinks were so essential. The brewing process, though simple, made the liquid safer. So, when medieval folk drank ale, they were not only seeking merriment, they were also protecting their health. The tavern keeper's ale might taste different from the ale served just a few villages away. Each household or tavern had its own recipe, its own quirks. Some ales were flavored with herbs, spices, or even fruit, depending on what was available. Imagine a mug of ale with a faint hint of rosemary, or perhaps one with a bitter tang from too much sage. There were no strict rules, only traditions passed down, adjusted with whatever the brewer could find. Drinking in the tavern was rarely about refinement. There were no crystal glasses, no careful pouring. A mug was filled from a large wooden cask, foamy and uneven, sloshed across the table to whoever had paid for it. And yet, despite its rough presentation, that first sip after a long day of labor was pure relief. It was common for the tavern to serve its drinks in communal fashion. A group might share from the same large jug, passing it around the table. Each person took a gulp and handed it on. This act of sharing was more than convenience, it was symbolic. To drink from the same vessel was to trust one another, to declare yourself part of the same circle. Thus, the drinks on offer in a medieval tavern were simple, rustic, and far from the polished beverages we know today. But they were essential, not only for hydration and health, but also for the ritual of togetherness. Each mug was a small moment of joy, a pause in a life that was otherwise full of toil. Now that we have a drink in hand, let us linger in the tavern a little longer and notice its atmosphere more closely. The first thing to understand is that taverns were not designed for elegance. They were not polished inns with carved furniture or grand feasting halls with glittering chandeliers. A tavern was simple, rustic, and sometimes smoky to the point of making your eyes water. Yet this very roughness was part of its charm. The light was always dim. Candles made of tallow, not the clean white wax of later centuries, gave off a smoky glow. They sputtered and dripped unevenly, sometimes leaving small black trails down the walls. Alongside the candles, the great hearth fire provided both light and warmth. The fire was the tavern's heart, drawing people toward it during winter nights and serving as a place to cook stews or roast meat. The smell of wood smoke clung to every corner. The walls were usually plastered over timber beams, uneven and marked with cracks. Some taverns hung bunches of herbs overhead, both for luck and to help with the smell. The rushes on the floor were meant to soak up spilled drink, but they grew damp quickly and added their own earthy odor. It was not unpleasant, only rustic, a reminder that the tavern was a lived-in place. Noise was constant. Even when no musicians played, there was a hum of voices. Farmers discussed crops, travelers boasted of distant towns, and merchants haggled over goods. Sometimes the noise swelled into songs. A few drinks loosened tongues, and soon a group might burst into a chorus everyone knew, voices rising unevenly but cheerfully. The furniture was heavy and simple. Benches with no backs encouraged closeness. Tables were scratched and uneven, stained with years of spills. Pewter mugs clanked on their surfaces. At night, the entire tavern seemed to glow in warm tones-brown wood, orange firelight, soft yellow candlelight, creating an atmosphere that was far more welcoming than the cold darkness outside. The tavern keeper moved constantly. They refilled mugs, served bowls of stew, and kept a sharp ear for trouble. Though taverns could grow loud, they were rarely allowed to grow dangerous. The keeper's word was law, and most guests respected that, for they knew they would need to return again and again. The atmosphere of a medieval tavern was, in short, cozy in its roughness. It was not luxury, but it was a kind of comfort. It was the warmth of shared company, the cheer of voices in the night, and the simple relief of not being alone. In the heart of a medieval village stood a building that was more than just a place to eat and sleep. It was a hub of stories, a melting pot of cultures, and a stage for life's daily dramas. It was the tavern. And just like today, the tavern was the center of town, right in the middle of the village square. Its thick walls were a fortress against the elements, hiding within them tables, benches, and hearths. As soon as the sun began its slow descent, the tavern doors would swing open and the ritual would begin. First to arrive were the villagers, the backbone of the community, the farmers. They came straight from their fields, their boots still caked in mud, and the scent of fresh, turned earth clinging to their clothes. Their hands, rough and calloused, would grip their mugs firmly as they settled onto the benches. These men and women spoke little, their words slow and deliberate, much like the rhythm of the seasons they lived with. Their talk was of the weather, of crops and livestock, of births and deaths. They shared news, rumors that had made the rounds in the market, gossip about the miller's daughter and the cobbler's son. They came to this place not just to warm themselves, but to warm their spirits. They drank deeply, not only to forget the aches in their bones, but to forget the isolation of their labors. For in the field, a farmer is often alone, his thoughts echoing in the vast expanse of the land. But here in the tavern, he knew he was not alone. There were others who understood his joys and sorrows, others who toiled and hoped as he did. After the farmers came the travelers, merchants, messengers, wandering craftsmen. These men and women were adventurers in a world that was mostly static. They carried stories in their eyes and their words. One might have seen a great city where the streets were paved with gold and the towers touched the clouds. Another might have crossed mountains so high that they scraped the sky. They spoke of distant lands and strange peoples, of bustling markets and towering cathedrals. To the villagers who rarely ventured more than a day's walk from their homes, these tales were like windows to the outside world, allowing them to peer into the grand vistas beyond their fields. Then there were the entertainers, the minstrels and actors, jugglers and acrobats. They added their tunes and laughter to the mix, weaving joy into the fabric of the evening. Minstrels with their lutes or fiddles would sing songs of love and loss, of battles and feasts. Some would tell stories, weaving sagas of brave heroes and devout saints that left the tavern hushed with wonder. Others sang bawdy songs that had the room roaring with laughter. For a few hours, the tavern would become a theater, the tables and benches disappearing into the mists of make-believe. And when the applause died down and the actors packed up their props, the illusion would shatter and the space would hum with the murmur of everyday life once again. Occasionally, a wealthier figure would grace the tavern with their presence, perhaps a minor noble passing through or a member of the clergy. Their arrival would shift the room subtly, and the tavern keeper would be quick to pour them a flagon of the finest ale. Villagers would watch them with a mixture of curiosity and caution, speaking in softer tones when they drew near. Yet even these grand visitors could not resist the tavern's charm for long. Soon they too would be part of the murmuring crowd, sharing stories and laughter over tankards of ale. And then there were the strangers, the lone travelers with hoods pulled low, their faces obscured by shadows. They stirred a different kind of curiosity, a mixture of intrigue and suspicion. Who were they and where did they come from? What news did they bring from distant lands? In a world where news traveled slowly, strangers were like whispers on the wind, carrying tales of places unseen and events unknown. They were both welcomed and hesitated. Each stranger was a new story waiting to be told, each one a potential friend or foe. And when the tankards were drained and the stories shared, many a stranger had become part of the crowd, their anonymity shed like an old cloak. As the night deepened, the tavern's glow spilled out onto the cobblestone streets, beckoning all who passed by. Within its four walls, differences were forgotten. A farmer, a merchant, a minstrel, a noble, a priest, and a pauper could sit side by side, sharing a table, sharing a story, and sharing a drink. The tavern was more than just a building. It was a community, a stage, a home. It was the heart of the village, beating with the pulse of life itself. Drinking in a medieval tavern was not about cocktails or wine pairings or carefully measured pours. It was about mugs filled to the brim and passed from hand to hand. Ale was brought in, heavy wooden or pewter vessels, foamy at the top, and sloshing as they were set down. Then the drinking began. It wasn't uncommon for a tavern to serve up to 100 people at once, all eager for a drink and a good time. Mugs were piled up on the counter, waiting for the barkeep's free hand to fill them. He pulled out a rope, sending a gusher flow of ale into the tankard. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he sent it on its way toward a customer. The recipient took the mug and held it up for a moment, then drained it in one long pull. Tankards were refilled and passed around until the wood was polished smooth by eager hands. As the evening wore on, faces grew red and voices louder. Some men slapped their companions on the back, some argued loudly with strangers. A few cried out for more drink. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and stale urine, but everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. The tavern was alive. And then there were the stories. The stories that flowed out of this tavern like the ale. A man might begin, bragging about his single fox he had caught in the fields that very day. One beer in, he was fighting off a wolf, his wits and his courage failing him as the beast loomed closer and closer. By the time he reached the end of his tale, the tavern roared with laughter, slapping him on the back and buying him another round. But it was all a lie. He had only seen a small fox and chased it in jest. A traveling merchant might start up another. He had made the journey from London to York in 3 days, racing against the clock and the weather. His horse stumbled, fell, and died, leaving him to finish the journey on foot. Just as he reached the gate to York, the mayor himself rode out to meet him, wanting to hear firsthand of the plague that ravaged London. And so the merchant stayed in the finest inn, ate the best food, and slept in a warm bed while the mayor paid him handsomely for his tale. And every night the mayor hosted him for drinks, and he drank with lords and ladies, danced with beautiful girls, and it was glorious. By the 3rd tankard he had been there a week and was now drinking with the king, and everyone listened intently as he described the royal jousting tournament, full of daring knights and a fierce dragon that breathed fire, and then the story ended because he had never left London. He had only heard the tales. And once again, the tavern roared with laughter as the poor barkeep tried to keep up with all the new customers who came in to hear the latest news. Sometimes games broke out. Simple, drinking games. Who could drain their mug the fastest? Who could stand up on their chair and sing a song without falling over? Who could repeat the names of all the apostles in order? And when the barkeep joined in, he raised the stakes. Who could stay upright the longest and still answer a riddle correctly? Whoever lost had to buy a round of drinks. Then there were the songs, the old, well-known ones and the new bawdy ditties. Everyone knew at least one verse, and as the night went on, more and more people joined in until someone forgot the words and the entire tavern burst into laughter. Getting drunk in a medieval tavern was not like getting drunk today. The ale was weaker than modern beer, so it took many mugs to reach a truly unsteady state. But when it came warmly, like a heavy blanket settling over the body. People swayed with the rhythm of songs, clapped out of time, or leaned too heavily on their companions. To get drunk in a medieval tavern was to be part of a group, to drink and sing and laugh together. It was to tell stories and play games with no thought for tomorrow. It was to feel the warmth of the tavern and the company all around, to forget one's worries and lose oneself in the moment. For a few hours, the world outside didn't exist. There was only the tavern, the drink, and the companionship. And when the tavern was full of noise and laughter, it was easy to feel lighthearted and free. For a few hours, the weight of the world lifted, and there was nothing but good cheer. A tavern was not only about ale. It was also about food hearty, simple, filling food that balanced the drink. Now, hear me out. You may think you know what a medieval tavern was like because you've seen the movie Braveheart. But I'm here to tell you that's not accurate, not at all. In fact, it was nothing like that at all. Okay, maybe the dirk was accurate, but the rest of it, not so much. In reality, a tavern was a place where a weary traveler could get food and drink and maybe even spend the night. And no, there weren't scantily clad women dancing on tables or men fighting with swords over some silly insult. It was more likely that the tavern was full of men just wanting a hot meal and a flagon of ale. The most common offering was stew, thick, steaming, and made with whatever was on hand, It might contain beans, cabbage, onions, and a little salted meat if fortune was kind. It was served in wooden bowls, eaten with coarse bread used more as a spoon than anything else. The bread was heavy, dark, and coarse, but it filled the stomach quickly. Sometimes it was flavored with herbs or onions, but often it was plain. In some taverns, cheese might appear, either served with the bread or as a topping for the stew. Pickled vegetables were a common addition to a tavern meal, as were dried fish, sprats, and herrings. If the tavern was near the coast, dried fish was a good source of protein and fat and went well with the bread and the stew. If the tavern had an oven, the patrons might also enjoy a meat pie, usually filled with whatever small game or poultry was available. Larger joints of meat were too expensive for a tavern, so it was more likely that a patron would get a small piece of bacon or sausage with their meal. Ale also accompanied the food, served with the meal and between courses. The tavern keeper might serve a lighter beer with the food and save the stronger brews for after the meal. Overall, the food in a tavern was not refined, but it was sustaining. It was a filling meal that gave the body strength after a long day on the road or in the fields. For many, eating in the tavern was as important as drinking, for it offered a meal that might be richer than what they could prepare at home. For example, the famous Spanish dish paella originated in Valencia as a peasant food, but it was elevated when it was served in Madrid taverns to nobles who were impressed by the saffron flavor and the variety of ingredients. Even humble bread was often better in a tavern than at home, since flour and yeast were expensive and in short supply. Many families could not afford to bake fresh bread every day, so they might eat their stale bread dipped in their stew or their ale. The smell of food filled the room, blending with the smoke and ale. A bubbling pot over the hearth reminded everyone that warmth and sustenance were always close. In this way, food anchored the tavern. It was not only a place to drink, but a place to be nourished. And let's face it, after a hard day's work, what is more important than good food and a good drink? So the next time you're watching a movie about medieval taverns, remember that while the battles may be epic, the food is truly what makes the tavern an important part of life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Also, be sure to visit our website for more information on medieval history. Until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and eat plenty of carbs. As the night deepened, the tavern slowly shifted. The songs quieted, the fire burned lower, and the laughter softened into murmurs. Some guests nodded off at their tables, heads resting on folded arms. Others staggered to their feet, preparing to step back into the cold night. The tavern keeper moved about, snuffing candles and collecting mugs. They might nudge a sleeper awake or, if the guest was trusted, allow them to rest on a bench until morning. Outside, the village was silent, but inside, the memory of warmth and company lingered. For the medieval villager, this night in the tavern was more than recreation. It was a reminder that even in a hard world where winters were cold, harvests uncertain, and life short, there were still moments of laughter, of sharing, of simple joy. And so, as the last ember glowed in the hearth and the tavern door closed, the guests carried home not just the heaviness of ale, but the lightness of community. The tavern, rough and smoky though it was, gave them something priceless: connection. In a world without electricity or internet, the tavern was the medieval equivalent of a community center, a place where people came not just to drink, but to connect, to play, to dance, to hear music, and to swap stories. It was a place where the boundaries between classes were blurred and everyone, from the village blacksmith to the lord of the manor, could be equals, at least for an evening. And while we think of medieval taverns as dark and dirty places filled with rowdy peasants and traveling minstrels, they were also, above all, social hubs, much like the pubs and bars that still serve as the backbone of many communities today. When the sun began its slow descent, villagers would start making their way to the tavern. For men, this was often a part of their daily routine, a place to unwind after a long day of work. For women, it was more of a weekend destination, a place to visit when they had finished their household chores or had accompanied their husbands to the market. Children were generally not allowed in taverns, and those who did sneak in were often asked to leave. This wasn't just because of the rowdiness, but also because of the cost. The price of admission for a medieval tavern was typically a tankard of ale, and once inside, other expenses awaited, such as entertainment, food, or perhaps a prostitute. There were also games to pay for, such as dice or cards, and gambling was a popular pastime, although many taverns banned it. So, for a poor peasant with a family to feed, a night out at the tavern could be expensive, which is why it was usually reserved for special occasions or, for the very poor, a good night's sleep. During the Middle Ages, most taverns were attached to an inn, which provided lodging for travelers. Peasants who lived far from the village and had to travel to market often stayed overnight, as did merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. These travelers would pay for their room and board with whatever money they had, and innkeepers were expected to provide them with a certain standard of service. That meant no matter a traveler's social status, they could expect a clean bed, fresh linens, and a hot meal. But it also meant that innkeepers were often the targets of thieves and cutpurses, so they kept their valuables locked up tight. In fact, many inns were built with a strong chest in mind, so much so that some became known as bank vaults. So what exactly did someone do in a medieval tavern? For one thing, they drank. Ale was the most common drink, and while wine was available, it was more expensive. There were also ciders, meads, and beers, and travelers often brought their own wine or beer with them when they went on a journey. Food was also served in taverns, and menus varied depending on the season and location. But common dishes included things like roasted chicken, bread, cheese, and fruit. In some cases, prostitutes were also present, either as entertainers or for the use of customers. This was more common in larger cities, however, and was frowned upon in more rural areas. In addition to eating and drinking, people also gambled, fought, and made deals in taverns. Gambling was particularly popular, and dice games were common. There were also card games, but these were usually reserved for the upper classes. Since literacy was rare, most people played games based on chance rather than skill. But while gambling could bring in a lot of money for the tavern owner, it could also lead to fights and brawls. And to keep order, many taverns hired guards who would patrol the premises and break up any disturbances. Perhaps the most important aspect of a medieval tavern, though, was the sense of community. For many people, it was the only place where they could escape the drudgery of everyday life and be themselves. It was a place where they could relax and enjoy the company of others. And while life in the Middle Ages was often difficult, the tavern provided a much-needed respite. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.